Our final fireside chat before the lunch break will be with Dr. Jean Leon, the President of the Caribbean Development Bank, and the interviewer is James Alsmore, the CEO of Island Innovation. Let's welcome them on stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As was mentioned, my name is James Ellsmore, the CEO of Island Innovation, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jean Leon, the President of the Caribbean Development Bank, one of the organizations that has been a real force during these negotiations to represent the Caribbean and SIDS as a whole. So thank you very much, Dr. Leon, for being here with us. How's your COP going so far?
Thank you, James. Well, the COP is moving along. It's the first few days of it. The real negotiations are likely to be packed towards the end. When I say real, the closing aspects of the negotiations. But it's a process that has started from, I would argue, not just last COP, but the previous COP, as we move towards a couple of milestones, particularly the pledging of the 100 billion that had been mentioned before. Doubling of adaptation finance, the setting up of the loss and damage fund. All of those are big milestones that we hope should be emerging out of this COP. Yeah.
Now, this year, the Caribbean Development Bank is here in force.
Yeah.
And maybe you could just help us explain a little bit the role of a development bank, especially a regional development bank like yours, in these negotiations. Why is it important that the bank has a voice in these conversations and represents the region?
Well, we are not technically in negotiations because negotiations take place among parties, and that's the governments themselves who are actually in there. But we play a more advocacy role in terms of advocating for certain key elements that go into negotiations. We play a role of providing support to the governments in terms of what they do when they go into negotiations. And so that's maybe the bigger role we play in COP now as opposed to actual negotiations. Yeah.
How did you take then the news from last week about the loss and damage fund? What was the bank's position on that announcement?
Well, I wouldn't think it's the bank's position per se, but clearly a position that all institutions would see. Loss and damage, to put it mildly, is the long-term permanent effect of climate change on countries. And therefore, as you think of it in that sense, it was almost a necessity to have some degree of loss and damage for countries. And so the idea of setting it up, which was done in Egypt last year, and the progress made this year, as recent as early November, to say that they were going to fund and various countries agreeing to pledge, tells us that that is a very positive and welcome event, and everyone should agree with that. The issue that I have personally, if I can raise this, is the needs of loss and damage are so huge, that the first setting up amount is only going to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Further, many countries have been impacted by loss and damage events. And so it forces you to two very key questions. First is, how do you allocate the amounts that are pledged, and let's assume they are delivered immediately? How do you allocate that? By what criteria, to whom? So that becomes an important distinction, and therefore it tells you you need to have an appropriate measure of loss and damage. How do you determine when is loss and damage more critical to any particular country? Then what is the need of that country so that you can begin to say how are you going to allocate and prioritize for a couple of countries. And so that's probably the biggest hurdle. And I'm sure we will find ways of being realistic in trying to carve out what you have. Some people will be disappointed, obviously, in that initial stage. Some will be happy they got something. But that's a major issue we'll need to confront. And then the second part of this is, even if you are pledging and you are starting, again, because that need is so large, we will need to equally have continuing pledges to keep topping up and adding more to that fund to meet the goal of reducing that overall impact of loss and damage. So there's still a long way to go, but it's a very strong positive step and signal, and I think it should be welcomed across the world.
And clearly there's still a lot to be ironed out in the conversations around the fund and how those funds will be allocated and the future. Do you feel that the voice of the small island developing states is being heard? I mean, one of the big concerns is the vulnerability of the small island states is not taken into account. We know that there is often many of your member states in the Caribbean are classed as middle income or upper income countries. So they haven't always had the funding that they should do available.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, James, because that's in fact part of what I was referring to when I talked about criteria. The entire framework that we have been operating under, the entire international community, is one of GNI, gross national income, as the basis on which we determine development, the basis on which we determine need. Now, what is very clear is that that is not, and I want to underline not, adequate to talk about what development actually is. And a large part of the development needs of small island development states is not so much the structural impediments that limit our ability to grow, because we have been growing, and hence why most of us are middle income. But it is the fact that you have very key vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are largely, in some cases, climate related. And I expect it to intensify as the climate change impact grows. But equally important is, after an event occurs, whether it's a hurricane, an earthquake, flood, drought, after an event occurs, what matters is not the preliminary pre-event vulnerability. What matters is your ability to be resilient, to grow back, to bounce back to the level you were before the event. And God forbid, before the next event hits you. And so it is that recovery, that duration, at which point your income, your ability to deliver income has been decimated. That is the point where you need the most need. But conventional paradigms of gross national income do not take that into account. Current overseas development assistance, in fact, penalizes you. That even after an event occurs, and I take the case of Dominica, when one of the hurricanes, Maria, hit Dominica, the impact was approximately 225% of GDP. So that's the amount of a hit. But yet, the income per capita that you had in Dominica before that hurricane hit is the number that you are going to use to say this country is a middle income country and therefore doesn't qualify for assistance. And so we need to rethink and change the way we look at countries. What's the appropriate measure to determine need? And what we at the bank have been proposing is you need to talk about resilience capacity of countries as an appropriate measure. And so we've been working very strongly on how do we define that, how do we measure it, and hopefully get the world community to accept this as at least a measure to be used when you start assessing countries' need for finance, for loss and damage, for overseas development assistance, to be able to then say it is not the income that you have, but the need for income, more financing, to help you recover when the impacts of things like climate change occur, this is a more appropriate, fairer, and easier way of helping to meet development needs.
Absolutely. And we know that during COVID, that the region was one of the worst hit in the world economically, and there's been a bounce back there. But part of resilience is also the economic diversity. And one of your roles with the bank is the green trade and commerce angle, which I presume comes back to this need for economic diversification, and that plays into resiliency. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, economic diversification is one way of reducing or mitigating the very vulnerability we talk about. Yes, high income, yes, countries are focused on one or two specific services or areas, whether it's finance, tourism, or broader trade. I think the bigger issue is how do you facilitate that? And how you facilitate that economic diversification is by creating what we at the bank are talking about as a holistic system of development. In other words, you cannot see development as a slice. And to be able to do that, there are three things that need to happen and happen concurrently. One is you need to have fit-for-purpose investment activities that are capable of moving you to the trajectory you desire in terms of your development. You need adequate and affordable finance, and you need capacity building that is not just project management, but capacity to increase your whole country's ability to innovate, create, and stay, and move your trajectory upwards. And two of those actually matter. The first is the green trade that you talk about. Trade becomes the facilitator of growth, but it is also a tool for reducing inequities. And inequities is what exists in the world today. And so first, facilitating that growth through trade is important. And in the particular context of linkages, a whole system where we think trade ought to be focused now is the trade-climate nexus, and hence the issue of green trade. Green trade now becomes the means through which you interact, you bring climate-related elements into the whole trade system. And by that we are talking elements that have to do with mitigation, elements with adaptation, elements with loss and damage, and elements with disaster risk management. And whether it's in trade in goods, trade in services, and how you facilitate those, as long as you could make them green in the sense of highlighting climate-related benefits, whether it is the use of renewable energy or the production of goods that can now be traded through the medium of renewable energy products, green hydrogen, etc. That means then your trade becomes a platform through which you can actually generate growth. But there's one point I'll quickly make before I go. It's on the finance side, because that's a large part of what we are talking about. Countries are not able to grow because they've now run out of fiscal space. In principle, every time an event occurs, a hurricane hits, as I like to say it very clearly, the hurricane washes away all of your capital, your infrastructure, but leaves you with the debt that you took to put that infrastructure in place. Worse yet, to rebuild that infrastructure, you have to actually borrow more. And so over time, as more and more hurricanes hit, and they will continue and become more intense, debt of countries have continued to rise. And once you are at that high level of debt, you no longer can, in principle, borrow anymore. It's not a risk that anybody is willing to take. So one of the elements we think that is equally needed in that climate space is how do you find ways of creating room for countries to be able to manage those impacts that are coming through. And we are now working with Lazard and about to issue a report, actually. We might do so as a press release at COP. A means through which we can design a class of instruments that takes on literally almost a very large, significant part of our balance sheet that will provide protection to countries that when an event occurs, all of their debt, principal, and capitalized interest will be paused, and paused for a particular period of time. Now, what that means is it's going to have an impact on the balance sheet liquidity side of the bank, And so we've now come up with the novel idea of issuing liquidity type instruments on the liability side, which will in principle mirror the increased cost of the asset on the asset side. And by doing that, it becomes risk neutral and therefore preserving of the credit rating of the bank and ability therefore to borrow on terms that will facilitate on lending to countries at reasonable rates. And that, I think, is one of the things that we will need to look at, because it's equivalent to giving money, but not giving money, but deferring money you would have paid, and therefore freeing up fiscal space for countries to be able to manage the impacts of those events as they actually occur.
Thank you for that very, very thorough answer. I think that's very important. Just before we wrap up, I'd like your final thoughts on how optimistic you are about the COP process. There's, like every COP, there's been much criticism of the COP this year and the process. What do you think we see on the road ahead?
Yeah, I am optimistic, not for exactly what will be achieved in this COP. And I think that's a mistake we make. We tend to see COPs as discrete events. COP is a process, it's a continuum. It starts, it grows, it continues, it implements it, and it advances. The COP process itself, I am ultimately very optimistic about. We have no choice. It is urgent, climate change is with us, and we have to overcome it. And I'm sure we will. The question is the pace, and how much and how expectations are met that we have at each COP. And personally, I think what we should be doing now is pivoting this to let's talk about a 3-year program for COP. It will continue to have annual COPs, but each COP could be seen as part of a 3-year agenda. And if we see that, then I think we will be able to temper better, manage better, and be a lot more optimistic, because you'll see it as building within an actual process.
Dr. Leon, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some insights about your work. Thank you.
Thank you.